All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's conversation about Netflix's new documentary, Crip Camp. We are really glad you're joining us for this very important conversation. My name is Bethany Fox. I'm the pastor of Beloved Everybody Church. This is a church in South LA where people with and without intellectual disabilities lead and participate all together. And so we're the ones who are hosting this conversation. So the way this is going to work tonight, we will have some facilitated conversation for a while. We've had some questions developed in advance to talk about. We'll see how those go. We're not super formal with it, but we have some structure that we might use. And then we'll leave some time for sure at the end that you can ask questions to our panelists. There's a Q&A box at the bottom if you click Q&A where you can enter a question, or you can enter it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. But probably it would be best if you're able to enter just kind of the gist of your question in the Q&A box, and then I'll unmute you and you'll be able to ask the panelists your question at the end. I'll review that again when we get to that point, but that's just a preview of things to come. So I'm really excited to welcome our fantastic panelists. It'll be great to talk about this movie both from a disability perspective, but also being people of faith and other ways that our embodied identities frame how we think through some of these issues. So it's going to be an exciting conversation. So we'll start off just by introducing you to each of the panelists. The first person I'll introduce you to is Letiah Fraser. The Reverend Letiah Fraser is a New York City native that now lives in Kansas City. She's an ordained pastor in the Church of the Nazarene and is a doctoral student at Nazarene Theological Seminary. She's currently studying disability theology and spiritual formation, and she's a team member and leader of the Kansas Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. So if you could just maybe, Letiah, say a couple of things about your faith background and also any information about your disability that you think would be helpful for people.
So I was born with cerebral palsy, and so disability has always been a part of my identity. And my faith background is that I did not necessarily grow up with faith as part of my story, but around my preteen, teenage years, I got connected to a Pentecostal church and was part of a Pentecostal church until my early college years. So from 11 till early college. And then I went to a Christian college that is connected with the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and did that for the 4 years. And then I moved out to Kansas City, and that's where I got connected to the Church of the Nazarene. So I've had a wide variety of church experiences that way.
Great, thank you. And next I'd like to introduce you to Rosalba Rios. She also goes by B, which I will probably call her because that's what I usually call her. So sorry about the informality, but we're all friends here. So Rosalba has a BS in studio art from Biola University in La Mirada, California, an MS in clinical counseling from California State University, Fullerton, an MA in theological studies from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. And Rosalba currently works in mental health, serving underprivileged children and families in the Los Angeles area, and is also a very talented visual artist. I added the very talented. She didn't put that in her own bio, but I think you all need to know that. So do you want to say a few things maybe about your faith, disability?
Yeah, hello everybody. So I'll go by B. I have a neuromuscular disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth, and I was born with that. It's a genetic disorder, and my disability is pretty profound. Like, I don't have a lot of upper body strength, so I look more like a quadriplegic. And so part of my disability has been evolving because when I was younger, I was able to walk. So part of neuromuscular sometimes conditions is that they evolved over time. So mine is not life-threatening, but it is, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty about like severity and how it's going to progress. So that's been, you know, my journey with my body and disability. The other thing is I'm originally from Mexico City. So I'm an immigrant. So, you know, I can definitely talk about disability outside of the US and how it's viewed and all of that. And then lastly, as far as my faith, my family was religious when growing up. We went to a Presbyterian church. But then when we immigrated to the US, we began going to a Baptist church. So I've kind of been similar to Letiah, kind of, I started at a Baptist and ended up at a Foursquare, ended up in like charismatic, and now I'm back to a Baptist. So a little bit of everything. So that's me.
Awesome, thank you. I'm glad you're here. And finally, Elizabeth Staszak is currently a student at Fuller Theological Seminary, working toward her Master of Divinity degree, and she also works in Fuller's Access Services office. She has an MA in Religious Studies from Claremont Graduate University and a BA in History from St. Norbert College. Elizabeth is working toward becoming a chaplain and learning how to advocate for access as a disabled woman. So welcome. Do you want to tell us some things about you?
Yes, thanks. So I am Elizabeth. I can go by that or Liz, doesn't matter. I am Coptic Orthodox. I converted about 5 years ago to the Orthodox Church from Lutheranism. So I made a shift in my faith. And only recently really decided to embrace my identity as a person with a disability. I spent most of my life hiding it. So I have cerebral palsy, and with that, kind of a host of other health issues that make me sort of unhealthy disabled. Just so I have a lot of chronic pain. So I'm often isolated, kind of. If this helps, quarantine does not feel that different to me than my normal life. So it's been an easy adjustment. Actually, being on these Zoom meetings, I see a lot more of my friends and family. So.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just start before any kind of structured questions. I would love to just have each of you share what were your initial thoughts and feelings as you watched the movie? Like, how were you initially reacting? What did you feel as you watched it, after you watched it? What are the things that just especially stood out to you? What felt impactful, meaningful, all of that? So why don't we have B kick us off for this question?
Oh man. So I watched it 3 times because I really wanted to. The first time I think I was in like shock. It was shocking, not in a negative way, but I think I was just processing the impact. And the reason why I say that is because there were things at work that I remembered that I did not, I normally don't think about. And so because I come from Mexico City, Mexico does not have, so I was, you know, this is in the 80s, late 70s, 80s. And so there was a little bit of familiarity with what they were talking about, you know, even though it was a different era. So, you know, there was that. And then the other thing is, I think at the end of the movie, Jim talks about how he tried so hard to fit in, something like that. That was kind of the gist, that he felt like he had overcome his disability, that, you know, he realized like that he cut off like a part of himself. And I would say that that's kind of the thing that I was processing. And I watched it last night and I was still thinking of pondering about that. So over the years, that's something that I, that's something that I've struggled with. I did not have, and to this day, I don't have a lot of people in my life that have disabilities. So yeah, so in a nutshell, that's what why the movie was just so moving, and the advocacy aspect of it is just empowering. I mean, I felt super empowered in a way that I don't think I've ever seen something that made me feel quite like that. So that was the other thing that was like, very powerful for me.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm gonna be, I talked with the panelists ahead of time about that I'll be like calling them out to answer, just so we don't have a lot of talking over each other.
Yeah.
So I'm not being a jerk. We agreed to this format, just so you know. Okay, Elizabeth, let's hear, what were your initial thoughts? Tell us as much as you want.
I had so many different feelings watching the film, and I made a list. So first of all, I cried a lot. I cried out of empathy, just understanding some of the people's experiences or their feelings. And I also cried with a lot of joy, just this utter joy and seeing like freedom, just being able to be who you are as a disabled person, having a past, which is what I tried to do my entire life. And, watching them play sports at the camp, where they would like crawl on the ground and if they needed to, and like butt the ball with their head. And that was okay. It wasn't looked on as like strange or abnormal, because I've definitely been in situations where like I feel like my balance isn't right and I'd rather like get down on the ground and scoot, but that's not what a normal person would do. And so seeing that gave me this feeling of freedom and permission almost to just live the way I need to live. I also felt a sense of solidarity and community that I've never felt in my life. I am similar to B in that I don't have a lot of friends with disabilities, at least overt or like physical disabilities. And so I think my initial feeling, I felt grateful that they had brought in people who had had different experiences with their disability, especially the guy who sort of opens the films, Jim, I think, is that it? And he kind of had said, like, I had prejudices about people with disabilities when I went to the camp, the summer camp, and that was helpful for me. I was able to think, okay, I'm not the only one, or I might have felt shock at some of the things I had seen, or felt uncomfortable, even as a disabled person trying to navigate that space. So that was really, really helpful for me, that it wasn't just everyone saying, we feel fine in our skin, we feel comfortable, and we, everything's great. So why aren't you on board? It was a little bit more of a sense of variety in the community, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. What about you, Letiah? I think you're yeah.
Okay, I'm on. I loved it. I had a variety of emotions as well. I have been mostly around people without disabilities, but I've also had the experience of going to Crip Camp. So when I was younger, it was a camp in New Jersey actually, and so it like reminded me of my time there, and I'm like getting on social media and like connecting with my camp friends, like, hey friends, did you see this? So it was just that solidarity, that place of like, I've always had friends, but when I went to camp, it was like we all had disabilities, so it was the normal thing, and it was the place where I could try all the things that maybe I would have been hesitant to try in school. So like I learned to swim at camp and all those things. So felt more freedom, and I felt like I could do anything. There wasn't anything I couldn't do. And I think a lot of that came from my time at camp. Also, like, I mean, I was 10, 11, and 12, right? Around, I think that was the oldest I was there. So like having your like first relationships and as a little kid and feeling like this is the normal thing that people do. And it was early 90s, so we would have like dance parties with like Boys to Men, and like it was just fun. So it just brought back a lot for me. And then I felt sad because I've also worked at a Center for Independent Living for 11 years. So like,
Can you say what that is for people that might not know?
a Center for Independent Living is a place that is run by the majority of people are people with disabilities, and helps people with disabilities to advocate for themselves in the community, and they have a number of core services to do that. So like employment, because we know that people with disabilities struggle a little bit more with finding employment because of stereotypes. And I was in the youth transition, so doing a lot of things with the youth group. So a space for people with disabilities to help each other, right? So, yeah. And then I think, so it reminded me of my time there, so I felt empowered, like, oh, I need to get back into the disability community, because a lot of what I do now as a pastor and as a hospital chaplain, I'm just not in that world, even though I am a person with a disability. And I felt sad because, like, I remembered my time at camp, and I remember feeling empowered, but like as I get older and continue to face like obstacles, I just was like, okay, this was like 1970s and we're still here. And it just looks different, but we're still here in some ways.
Awesome, thank you. So when I was watching the movie, I kind of felt like it's divided into two parts. So it felt like there was like the initial movement that was more, the way that I thought about it, and you guys can correct me or give me a different frame, but it felt like the first part was more of an inward movement, like a kind of personal development, building up identity, especially like a disability identity, things like that. And then the second movement was, and that first movement, again, like some of you have already hit on, was about new freedoms, about access, romantic relationships, other ideas for what the world can be like, all that kind of stuff that happened in relationship in the first section. And then the second part is more the fight for justice and accessibility through legislation and just more broadly in the country for all people with disabilities. So in keeping with that rhythm, I was thinking our conversation can kind of go in that flow a little bit too. And we'll start by asking a couple of questions about the inward movement for all of you. And you can be as, you can say whatever you want to say is great. And then the second half, we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of activist legislation movement sort of stuff. So, and we kind of already hit on this a little bit, but I'd like to talk about it maybe a little deeper. And that is how this thing about being in community and being around a lot of people with disabilities was such an empowering thing for people. And I know that Elizabeth, I think you said it in this conversation, but maybe you just said it to me, but had said, how it ignited a certain kind of longing even for that kind of space where you could be among people who you felt a certain kind of understanding or something. And then one of the campers in the movie, Jim Lebrecht, says, what we saw at that camp was that our lives could be better. And he said, the fact of the matter is, you don't have anything to strive for if you don't know that it exists. So I know, Letiah, you've actually gone to like a camp with disabled folks, and so you had that experience in a way, which sounds like it was really formative. Maybe you could talk more deeply about that and why it felt good. And then for those of you who haven't, for B and Elizabeth, who haven't been to a camp like that or been in a big crowd of people with disabilities just hanging out and having wild fun, you can talk about if there are other, maybe, I mean, all of you can talk about if there's been like an experience in disability community otherwise, or maybe people with disabilities in your life, even if it wasn't in like such a large scale, but people with disabilities in your life who opened up your imagination to who you could be or what life could be like, or anything like that. So why don't we, Elizabeth, why don't you start us off on this question? Share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I had a hard time with this one because I feel like I'm so new with the disability world, and I never wanted to be labeled as disabled, so I wasn't seeking out community with other people with disabilities, and a lot of times I felt, I think, this like hesitancy to work with communities or with people with disabilities, like when I was in AmeriCorps, for example, because I felt too much empathy or like it was like hit too close to home for me until I started to grapple with my health kind of declining a little bit more, or kind of cerebral palsy taking a like stress or like toll on my body, and then I really started having to start like grappling with that. And I would say one way in which I think I was introduced to sort of a wider reality was through Gillette Lifetime Clinic, which is for adults with cerebral palsy, and it's in St. Paul, Minnesota. So they have Gillette Children's Hospital where it had surgeries and things like that. And I had no idea this existed until a doctor recommended it to me. And all of a sudden I was able to see a physical therapist of which I've had like, I mean, probably like 15 or 20 different physical therapists in my life. And then now I had this physical therapist who was kind of showing me this whole new world and understanding where I was coming from in a way that no physical therapist ever had. That she understood why my body was doing some things, or how frustrating it was for me, or things I couldn't explain. She could give me words for. And as I was going to the clinic, then I saw more people with disabilities, and I felt so much more comfortable and at home. And that was probably in the last 3 years. So it's a pretty new experience, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Great, thank you. And Letiah.
What would you want me to talk about? Sorry.
This is the one just about some deeper thoughts about why being in community of people with disabilities. Like you said, you know, it wasn't a big deal, but maybe you could share a little bit more. I think people would benefit from hearing the contrast of what it's like to be in a community like at the camp you were at or at the Center for Independent Living versus all other communities that you're part of, maybe.
Yeah, I think at a Center for Independent Living or at the camp, we all knew that our bodies worked uniquely, and we all had things that we were dealing with. But I think it gave me an appreciation for difference in ways that I don't know that I would have gotten otherwise. Because yes, I have a disability, but I was the only one that I knew in my life pretty much with it. So like when people had seizures, I learned how to like help this person, and we figured out how to, like, I can't hold things like food and walk because I walk with crutches, and so we figured how we could help each other. And I think that's the joy for me about being in community with people with disabilities, because I just go, okay, I have CP. Has anybody else experienced this? What have you done? What are some of your tricks? And then I think too, which everybody's different, but this like humor that emerges that I think sometimes people without disabilities don't get, that like you can make fun of the ways that your body is just, you go, oh, that's a CP moment, like, you know. So for me, it helped me to be okay with my body as it is.
Yeah, awesome. And could you say a little bit about what it's like, how that contrasts with other communities in your life?
Yeah, so I will say I I have a hard time distinguishing sometimes because I have like intersectionalities as a person who's African American, a woman, and a person with a disability. And so sometimes when I walk into spaces, um, and because I am a pastor in a predominantly white denomination, but when I walk into spaces that are not necessarily disability friendly, I'm always wondering like what part of my identity is hitting them at the door first. And typically because I know it's the disability, right? So like I'm not even seen as a person sometimes. It's like you have a disability and then I'm Black and then I'm a woman, right? So like in ways that I might order that in a different way, or I see them connected, people can siphon those off. And so I think it denies my humanity sometimes. And in a place where everybody has a disability, it's like the disability is not even an issue. We're all like, okay, we're all in the same boat. Like, can we talk about something else now? You know, so yeah.
Yeah, it's
Can
really
I,
helpful.
oh, sorry. Can
Go
we
ahead.
jump in?
Yeah.
Are we allowed?
Yes.
So I really want to comment on Letiah because, yes, I definitely hear, and now that you were saying what you did about the intersectionality, I'm Mexican, I'm an immigrant, I'm a woman, and one of the, sometimes they all converge, and sometimes you pick and choose
Yeah.
which one you want to be today.
Yeah.
And I never really, I mean, it's so awesome to hear you say that because part of my experience as being a Latina is obviously the disability is the forefront all the time. And so, and for me, it feels like if I address the other identities, and I think that's where I've struggled with pretty much all my life is one, because acceptance has been a long road and a hard road for me, and two, it was easier to focus on my other identities and to fight for them and to advocate for them and doesn't mean that I didn't have my own journey of what it meant to be you know even accepting that and what it all of that, but I feel like in some way it was kind of a way to not deal with the disability part because I could just start talking about immigrant rights and start I grew up in the 90s in LA. We had it was there were also moments when I was in high school, there was like a big political situation. We had the LA riots. I was around that time, and so I think I was able to like not even think about disability at that time. I was more thinking of the racial stuff, but unfortunately it didn't I didn't know what to do with that until I was in college. That's when I really started wrestling with who I was as a person with a disability. So I just wanted to jump in, Letiah, about that intersectionality aspect of it.
Yeah, that's great. And did you have any other things you wanted to add, be about moments maybe in relationship with the disability community or people with disabilities that?
Yeah, I didn't mention it. Excuse me, but I did go to camp when I was a teen. I went to camp for two years, and so it's now that it's funny now that I talk about it, like things are starting to make sense in life. But like when I came to the U.S., I was 7, 8 years old, and prior to that, I did not really. I mean, I didn't know of anyone. I knew one girl who was deaf, but outside of that, I didn't have an idea. At that time, I was using crutches, and so I just, I didn't know any other person with a disability until I came to the U.S. and I was placed in a special ed class, and that was the first time that I saw other children in wheelchairs, and that was when I was actually placed in a wheelchair. So I feel like throughout my life, I've been oscillating between community, disability community, and not. And the reason why I struggled is because, and my parents were great. I'm not trying to say they're not great, but I think they also were struggling with what to do with me and all of that, like how to deal with having a child with a disability. So part of their strategy was to really inculcate that it didn't exist. So with that, then what I did is I actually pulled away from anything disability related, because one, of my own shame, two, because I was led to believe that that community was, and an example of that was when I was in 5th grade was the first time I was mainstreamed. So I arrived when I was in 2nd grade, and so for like 2-3 years I was in special ed, and my mom pushed to get me out because she was like, she didn't like the idea of me being in special ed, and she saw that I didn't really need to be mentally so that's why I think I had such a hard time. And by the time I went to camp, it was a positive experience. Like when I was watching the film, it was, I remember jumping in not jumping, but like, being in the pool and doing things that I normally would never do. And, just the whole romance thing. Of course, you have little crushes on, other good boys, and, super cute. And, but again, when I didn't want to go back. I only went for 2 years. And I was the one that was like, the older I was getting, the more I was like really shying away from all of that. And so even though it was a positive experience, there was something in the back of my mind that said that community is, I don't know, I think it had to do with my own lack of acceptance. So by the time I was a teen, like in high school, I did not want anything to do with disability whatsoever. But the irony is, like, the Lord literally kept thrusting me into those communities, because my first job in college was disability services. So the irony, right? And then like I ended up working in disability services after college, and it wasn't something I was seeking out. It was something I really felt like the Lord was just nudging me in that direction, to help with self-acceptance. Anyway.
Yeah, great. Does anyone want to add anything on that piece about?
I can definitely say that I think be in a similar sense, my family wanted me to always feel like I could do anything I wanted to. And because of that, I think in a sense, they would sort of like, I think trying to be helpful would downplay my disability, right? Kind of you know, like, oh, you're fine, you know, you're fine. It's not, you know, we want you to be like everybody else. And in a way that is, I mean, I think they're well intentioned in it, right? But because of that, I think I did similarly have this shame then, like, okay, well, if that's not normal, then that's not what I'm going to be. I don't want anything to do with the disability community, right? I'm trying so hard to keep up with everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the last thing I wanted, right? I would go to gym, and then I would have my gym teacher would take me out and work with me separately to give me some extra like physical help or attention, like for strengthening or stretching or whatever. And I didn't like being pulled out and isolated, kind of taken out of class and, you know, taken aside. I wanted to be with the rest of the kids. And yet I knew, like, I still don't really know how to swim. Like, so when we would have swimming lessons and things, like, my feet just don't do that, you know, not in the ways that kids, you know. So I would be in the first level of swimming, guppy swimming, and I was like way older than all the guppies, you know, because I just repeated the same level over and over again. And I didn't want anyone to see me like that, you know. And so I did have a lot of shame then. That was like, and so even though I think it was well intentioned, my parents were trying to get me exercise and help and therapy, and yet it was also, you know, nobody else in my family is disabled, so it is like it's uncomfortable for them to feel different as well. So I come by it honestly.
I think for me, maybe because of my intersectionalities, very early, I remember having a conversation with my dad, and, you know, we'd have those, like, I have to go visit my dad, we're gonna sit down and have those conversations you don't want to have. And he said, you're a woman, you're Black, and you have a disability, so you're just gonna have to fight like hell. And I've always just taken that as like, all right, like, so for me, I never experienced, at least as a kid, that because I had a disability, that didn't, like, it never clicked in my head that that meant that I couldn't do what people without disabilities couldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
So I was gonna, if I couldn't do it, I was gonna find a way to do it. And if you told me I couldn't do it, I was gonna do it just to say, watch me do it. But I think as an adult, maybe in the, like, last few years, I've seen more blocks because of my disability than I would have seen as a younger person. Like, I see now, like, the prejudice that was, because I was like, no, I'm gonna be that person with a disability that does it anyway, and I'm gonna show you that I can do it. And now, sometimes, you know, you can't kick the door open, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to go a little bit off. I feel like we answered the next question a little. So I'm going to, Matt had mentioned, and I think this is something all of you have brought up a little bit, are like family and caregivers and the relationships there. So I'm not going to call anyone out because this is a little bit of a, if none of you want to answer, that's also totally fine. But I think this is a piece of the conversation that is important to think about, which is that when you do have a level of dependency in terms of needing care for in different kinds of ways, whether that's all the time or whether that's during times of recovery from surgeries or different stages or whatever, the reality is when you have a kind of bodily level of dependency, there's a way that you are not as free, that the relationship with the caregiver there's a way that, you all know what I'm getting at, but there's a way that you can't always be fully yourself, and you can't always be as demanding or particular as maybe it would be justified to be because it's your body and everything. But I guess that was a conversation that happened at camp where some of the folks were sitting around and talking about that. So maybe if you could share, it doesn't have to even be your own experience, but it could be, but also just how that scene struck you and if that's something you've thought about a lot or how that's been. So who wants to raise your hand? So I'll start talking.
I'll
Okay,
jump in.
go ahead.
So part of my journey has been dealing with that. Like, I was walking till I was like 8, and then by the time I was 10, I was fully dependent on, because I wasn't able to even use my upper body strength, so needed help with bathing, dressing, self-care, toileting. And that's at a time where, it's the reverse. So from a developmental, from a psychological, the older you get, the more you individuate, the more you become your own person, and it coincides with psychomotor development and independence. In my experience, it was the opposite. The older I got, the more dependent I got, and it created this incredibly complicated and I'm going to throw in the intersectionality piece as well, because in Latino culture, Mexican culture, respect is a huge thing towards your elders, in a way that is maybe not so in like mainstream American culture, so if you throw that in there, so I was trying to individuate. I had my mom helping me do things that other people didn't, other kids my age didn't. And then on top of that, if I protested in any way, it was against, and what my parents threw in was, we were not American, we were Mexican. So even the fact that I was trying to, so there was also the acculturation piece of it and the cultural clash that happened. And when I saw that scene, Bethany, I would say that that was one that really, really got personal for me, because they were all there. I think one of the young ladies there, she said something about like not having the right to privacy, and that one hit home because I have not. I to this day, and I'm open about it now, I think, and that's part of because I've accepted that this is my life. I still need help with all those things, so I don't have bodily privacy in some way. I don't have it, and it's gotten more pronounced as I've gotten older. So when they were discussing privacy, that was something that was like, yeah, that's something that I still have to deal with. And but I think when I was younger, it was harder because you're at that time where you're into trying to individuate. And so there were a lot of conflicts with, I think Jim mentioned something in the film about like him wanting to speak up with his mom, but because he needed something from her, he felt he couldn't. And that is the complexity of the relationship, is you can't say it even though you're mad as hell and you want to cuss them out, and you really want to like storm out of the room. And I can tell you that as a teen, my way of like physically showing aggression was I would like purposefully, it was almost like when I would turn a corner, I would purposefully bump into the wall and like take chunks off, like with my wheelchair, with my electric chair. That was my way of showing like some form of, like most teens would like storm out and slam the door. And my version was like, yeah, doing that with the wall, damaging the wall. And I think that, that was just kind of the struggle with my parents when I was growing up.
Yeah, thanks. Did anybody else want to say anything briefly on this topic?
I was thinking, like, even now, I'm still dependent on my family for things, even if they're not personal caregivers, although they certainly have been, like, when I have surgeries and things like that. In some sense, I feel like I have no modesty. Like, I just kind of, it doesn't bother me to be in a hospital gown, or like, and just that's, like they're open at the back or whatever. And you just kind of end up being okay in that sense, maybe in a good way with your body. Like, you're like, okay, this is my body, these are its functions. But also, everyone wants to, have their privacy and have their, not be exposed, right? And I definitely, but even in the sense of dependence, like, I still depend on my family, even now, right? So I can't just go off and chart my own course like this super independent American woman and just be confident in the fact that I'll get a job, that I can physically work for full time and support myself and live on my own and do all the things that need to be done. I still have like a dependency on community, and sometimes I hate it. Like, I'm mad about it, and it's not fun for me. And I know my parents, they have done such a brilliant job trying to give me that independence and freedom as much as they can, like, even if I have to live at home when I'm not at school, just to sort of just to have a little bit more independence in a sense. But I definitely, like you, B, I related to James kind of talking about Jim, talking about his mom and kind of pushing back or not pushing back. And I'm sure I gave my parents a run for their money as like a sassy little white girl. I'm sure I did. Like, I'm sure I was not respectful of them in the way that I should have been during times of stress. So yeah, I can totally see the cultural difference too. I'm glad you pointed that out.
I'm going to move to the next question just so we can get through a few more questions and then open it up, because people are like already ready to like ask all kinds of questions. So, but I do want to get to a couple of these other topics. So if you could just each of you speak for a minute or two about, the movie doesn't talk about faith directly or about how someone's relationship with God or theology or faith formation was a part of their own disability identity development. But maybe I think it would be helpful, because so much of the movie is about identity development. And there are ways that as a person of faith that your identity development happens differently, or it's in a nuanced way. So maybe if each of you could share a little bit about how, God, church, friendships with Christians, your own relationship with God, whatever, both positively or negatively, how that influenced or impacted your road and path to a disability identity formation.
Yeah,
Do you want to start us off, Letiah?
Yeah. So growing up, I knew I had a disability, but it was never spun in a bad way until I started going to church. And I love them and they're lovely people, but it was a Pentecostal church. And so it was really, really fixated on healing. And so for me, I'm 11 and 12 and 13, and I'm like, everything is, hormones. And so you're telling me, like, I already feel like I'm not okay because of like normal teenage girl stuff. Mm-hmm. And then you're saying, hey, God loves you, but also you can have healing. And like, I just remember, and even going, because I went to a Christian college, having profound moments of like, we're going to pray for you. We're going to pray for you. Don't you feel anything? Oh, it's because you don't have enough faith. And I'm just confused because I've gone to school. I've done a whole bunch of other things. And the church is the one place that says, you're not okay. So I think, so for me, like around, and I think there are lots of things I learned from the Pentecostal church, but I knew that I couldn't stay in that space and still continue to believe in God, because I can't believe in a God that thinks having a disability is a bad thing. This is part of who I am as a person. So I had to struggle through that. Like, do I have enough faith? Is something wrong with me? All those things. And then, which is, there's a lot of trauma around church, and I think people don't realize in lots of churches where they have this thing around the altar. Like, I never go up. People are like, you want to pray? No, I don't want to pray. Don't touch me. Don't, no. So I think that's driven my passion for disability theology. Like, what is a better way that we can frame God? And so, yeah.
Thanks. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I have been thinking about this a lot in conjunction even with our previous question, dependency and vulnerability. And I've been thinking about what Jesus embodied and what he sort of did in his ministry, making us dependent on each other, right? Sending the disciples out with no extra money, no extra jacket, right? Nothing, just having that dependence on each other. And I think it's taken me a long time to get to this place, but I could say, like, I'm actually really grateful for my disability showing me how to be dependent, and in that sense, I'm very grateful that I recognize how difficult it is to be dependent on people and be okay with that dependence or like that vulnerability. And I think what I see for the church is like it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily embody that same or like mirror back what Jesus is showing us or how Jesus is showing us how to live, because especially in American context or in United States context, it's like you don't want to get help, you don't want to be dependent, you want to be independent, and you shouldn't ask for help, you know. But I think that's impacted my theology a lot, just thinking about how God is teaching us, and me included, humility and dependency in a way that is really tough for me as someone who is constantly having to accept help and learning how to be okay with that. So I would say that's how I've been thinking about the kind of the intersection of faith and disability so far. I really don't know about why some are healed and why some aren't, and I can't pretend to know the mind of God, so I'm not going to.
Do you want to share anything, Beat?
Oh boy. In a nutshell, I had without going too much into it, but I had a supernatural experience when I was very young, without my parents going to church. So God was very real from the very beginning. So when I was we ended up at a Baptist church. And so during that time is when I was really, really struggling. My disease was progressing very quickly. And I was, at the age of 10, I was dealing with suicidal. In fact, I tried to commit suicide at that young age. And the way that I viewed God, I think, was I knew he was loving, but I blamed him for what was happening. And it had to do with the changing nature of, the loss. So if it's something that it's a cyclical grief that I experienced and still experience. So it's not something that is something from the past. But in that, I found a lot of comfort in the crucifixion. That was, I think, and for me, I think the person of Christ has been the most powerful because there is such a corporal suffering. And I say this, you know, I don't want to perpetuate the notion that people with disabilities are suffering souls, but not everyone experiences this. But when you have something that just gets worse as time goes on, and you know all of this stuff, it is hard. And so throughout my life, it's a complicated relationship with God. And there'd be moments where I'd be really pissed off and blaming God, and you know. But the interesting thing is, even though I was super mad and hurt and trying to make sense of why, I always drew to Him, and I always like found comfort in bitching and moaning. And so Psalms, Job, you know, I'm so grateful for all those beautiful writers who just wail with grief, because it, you know, that's where I was at. And like Letiah, I ended up in charismatic circles, and it was, which is one of the reasons why I left recently. Because I just was like, I've had it, and I cannot reconcile their theology when it comes to healing. And you know, I look at scripture, and for me, and I'm not saying that charismatic circles are not theologically sound, but as a person with a disability, it is exhausting to have to, it's almost like I have to justify why I'm like this and okay with this. And I'm just tired of that. And you know, and it's taken me this long to understand that God made me just as I am. And the fact that I have a genetic disorder, I can actually say, like, you know, this is, I literally was made like this, genetically. So I refuse to believe that this was some form of satanic plot, because it just does not, I cannot reconcile that with I am fearfully and wonderfully made. That just doesn't seem to add up. So I left, and I have countless of stories, I'm sure as all of you, where people come up to you and even going up to the altar, even asking for healing. Like, you know, like I have asked for healing. I've asked for like, hey, I have stomach issues, please pray for me. Or I have other things. Yeah, even pain, physical pain. I deal with that now. But it just gets exhausting. Can you just pray for that and not for me to walk? You know, can you omit the walking part and just pray for the thing that I would like for you to pray for? That'd be great. Oh. I just got tired of that, so I left.
Yeah.
And I'm back in a Baptist church.
I feel like you were preaching in that answer, and I'm here for it. So thank you.
Yeah.
So
You could also become Orthodox, because all Orthodox do are suffer.
The what?
All the Orthodox do is suffer.
You know what, Elizabeth, I went to Barcelona in July of last year, and even though my dad's side of the family is Catholic, and I grew up, you know, Protestant, but there is this, I'm realizing more and more that I have this like incredible appreciation and fascination with, you know, like Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. And the reason why is because I think their theology of suffering is more spot on. And the crucifixion, she's like, yeah. yeah, it's just, it's so like healing for me. It's, you know, I feel like I can look at a crucifix and just really feel that connection to Jesus, the suffering. And so I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, I had for so many years, I wouldn't wear a crucifix or a cross because of my,
yeah.
like, it's like a symbol of death and execution and, you know, wrongfully getting murdered and all that stuff. But in the last couple of months, I really felt a connection to the crucifix, and so I was at a Catholic monastery in California just a couple months ago, and I got one, and it just made me remember that, like, God is a God who suffers with us, and so that's why I wear it as a reminder on those days where I'm like, oh, there you go. Okay, yeah. So.
That's awesome.
Awesome. This is really good. I'm going to move us along. And if you can answer this question very briefly, but I want to touch on this also because one of our attendees, I think Helen, commented on this as well. But this aspect of, and this is kind of more on the outward movement piece of it, but it's like how having a disability, there's an amount of solidarity that can happen with other groups experiencing inequality and injustice. And we saw that, you know, in the way that there was a counselor named Lionel Woodyard who talked about, you know, his experience of being a Black man in the South. And then he goes to the camp and realizes that folks in wheelchairs are experiencing a similar kind of thing out in the world. And then we notice that when they're doing the takeover of Secretary Califano's office in San Francisco, that the members of the Black Panther Party came to like give them food every day. And so, and I think there's just a way that, and there are definitely disabled members of the Black Panther Party who were an important part of this movement. But let's say that aside, for people who don't even have a disability, there's a way that there's a solidarity among people who've just experienced systemic injustice and things like that. So just wondering, in terms of as a person of faith, with your disability, with your cultural or ethnic identity, race, all those pieces, how you've experienced a sense of solidarity with other folks. And try to, and I know this is a huge question, but just try to sum it up so we can get to some questions from the others here. But yeah, why B? B, do you have something on that?
So let me just clarify, is it us with that or them towards us?
Either way, but how have you noticed a sense of kind of solidarity?
I have not.
Okay.
Unfortunately,
yeah.
Which is why this film was so impactful, because I was like, oh man, it was a different era. And I think because of that, the mindset was, you know, different even. So as a Latina and being whenever I bring this up in other circles, the response I get is it's almost like disability and injustice they're not on the same plane. And that's something that I notice in my own community, in my own like Latino, and I'm not gonna like generalize, but it's hard to consistently make a case for, yes, there is discrimination, and yes, there is systemic oppression with people with disabilities. And I feel like I say that a lot. I've been saying that a lot. On my end, I do feel solidarity, but maybe because I am an ethnic minority, I feel like there's also that piece that I see. But in a nutshell, I wish that other communities would, like in the film, you know, where they, again, I was thinking maybe it is a product of the time. And now, you know, unfortunately, there, yeah, I don't feel I have it, solidarity with other communities towards the disabled community.
Yeah, thank you. Letiah, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I would say the Poor People's Campaign and it's not perfect, but I think there's a willingness to want to understand, to recognize that uh, that we're all interlocking, that we're not all free until everybody's free, that sort of thing. But it's also, if you've never been around a lot of people with disabilities, you don't know what you don't know. So they want to be, but I just find that in other communities as well, that I'm often the teacher, and that's okay sometimes, but I'm like, go Google it yourself. Something, I don't know.
For real.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, so two things. First, I have noticed a little bit of sense of solidarity. Like, maybe it's all in my head, but sometimes when I'm using walking sticks and I'm walking down the street, especially in LA, where there are a lot of people experiencing homelessness, they will not ask me for help or money, and sometimes kind of like might nod at me or kind of smile. And I honestly think they feel a sense of solidarity with me and I with them, as people who are a little bit on the side, on the margin, and not a little bit. I mean, a little bit for me, I'm probably obviously more privileged, or I have more privileges. But I do appreciate that we kind of can recognize one another and that there are struggles going on. And I do appreciate that. And then I would also say, so my second thing is, I struggle as well to try to find that sort of solidarity with other groups. Especially, I want to tread lightly as a person with white privilege, to be very careful about treading into communities that maybe feel, I don't want to make them feel like they need to educate me, or I just want to listen. But maybe sometimes I think I've seen people try to empathize, and that is also shut down. And so immediately, like, that communication is kind of blocked, right? So that can be hard. You're trying to meet someone halfway, and they're not up for it, right? And we have this kind of like cancel culture, or like this sort of like shut down culture of kind of like, nope, I refuse to acknowledge that or talk about that. And so I feel like, it's a struggle for me. I would like to see more of it. And I understand I'm not going to be perfect in how I go about it, but I would love to try.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I appreciate those perspectives. So I'm going to ask one more question. Those of you who are attendees, if you have a question, if you could say that you have a question in the chat box and maybe a few words about what it's about, I can unmute you to give you a chance to ask the panelists your question. If you could give a little bit of and just try to be pretty brief in how you ask the question too, that would be great. So for the last question I'll be asking, there was this one, so Judith Heumann, who is just a powerhouse, an incredible person now, and then there was this line that like killed me, which was when she said, "I'm very tired of being thankful for accessible toilets. If I have to be thankful for an accessible bathroom, when am I ever going to be equal in the community of science?" It's such a like, it kills me because it's so true that like still today we expect people with disabilities to be grateful for like the most minor like accessibility adjustment, and like things that other people can take for granted, like school, transportation, like those things have had to be fought for at such a cost. And like you have to fight tooth and nail to like get a millimeter of access in this world. And so on that note, knowing that while we have come a long way, which we have, there is still a long way to go, I would love if each of you just took a second to share a couple of ways that you hope for the world to be different, because the movie is kind of about imagination building and thinking about what is a different world that could be. So what are a couple of ways that you could foresee the world being different than it is? And I know B has to go, so why don't you go first, B, in answering this question?
Oh man, I would love, maybe because I'm a pessimist. At the end of the film, Denise says, you can change the law, but if you cannot change something like that, like if you don't change people's attitudes, it's basically nothing. It's for nothing. And I feel that that is, I think right now, the biggest battle is the attitude. To see, I feel like if I were to look at it from a sociological perspective, so there was this pendulum swing, and now it's all within the context of like special needs and pity, and that's kind of the only narrative that I hear with regards to disability, and I really wish that would change. I really wish that people would see that in the community at large would see as individuals, as sexual beings, as all these things that other people they don't have to fight for those for the right to be considered as such. And I feel like right now I think that's kind of the biggest where we're at, is to change the attitude. And I don't have a specific way of changing that, other than I think the more allies we can gather, the more people can speak up. Letiah mentioned is that sometimes, we're called in to like a educating role, but that can take a toll. It's tiring to do that over and over again. So I think maybe, the LGBT community, they've done this where they gather allies, and maybe that's where we need to go, is to gather as many allies from, so that way they can help us change perception, because we can't, it's a bigger mountain than we can climb ourselves. So I think we need to maybe bring other people in that could be our allies.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
What B is saying, it seems like we shouldn't have to ask for that, and that's like the worst part of it, right? It seems like such a small ask. See us as humans, see us as beings with myriad desires and concerns, and that we're not inspiration, that we're just human and like
Right.
and yeah, it seems like such a small ask, and yet I feel like I'm asking for the moon. Like, hey, consider us in your triage rather than putting us to the back of the line in this pandemic, or don't act like you're the first person to live isolated lives during this quarantine, like remember us, right? I think that's like the biggest deal, right? Just remember us, and also empathize, and have some empathy, and yeah, I feel like just to be listened to, honestly. And I like B's idea of allies, because yeah, I think if the culture doesn't change, we could end this pandemic and go back to everything the way it was before, and providing very few accommodations after we've taken 2 weeks to make some pretty astonishing leaps in accommodations. And we could choose to go back that way, or we can choose to move forward and learn from it. And so that's my dream, that we would learn from it and use this time, even though it's a horrible time of suffering and pain, that this could be a catalyst for something, I guess.
Great. Thank you. Letiah?
Yeah, I guess I dream of a world where I don't want to have to feel like I have to do 3 times as more as somebody who isn't African American, who isn't a woman, and who isn't a person with a disability. Because if somebody without a disability needs help with something, it's fine. But it's like you have to put on this like I've got the world, nothing is gonna bother me sort of persona as a person with a disability, because at least in my experience, because then otherwise you're seen as you can't do it or it's too much for you. So I don't want to be superhuman for the rest of my life.
Amen. And I agree. Seems like it should be already done, but since it's not, let's keep on working toward it. So B, just whenever you need to go.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. Letiah, it was great
I
meeting
know.
you.
We could be Facebook friends.
Please. All right, I'll find you. Find me.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you so much. Thank you so much.
Bye.
So I'm going to unmute Michelle, who has a question for all of you.
Hello.
Hi, Michelle. Go
Hi.
ahead.
Hello. First of all, thank you for sharing all your experiences. My question is about charities and how they generate the sense of like pity in individuals with disability. I was raised Catholic, and right now I'm an undergraduate in rehabilitation, so I have a lot of like disability justice classes and a lot of that. So I learned about this term called inspiration porn. Is a term used by Stella Young, and I don't know. My question is, what way would you stop charities from being ableist, like from stopping that idea of individuals with disabilities have to be pitied? Because like pity generates like society lowering expectations from us. I am disabled. I have muscular dystrophy. So yeah, that's my question.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that question.
I don't know how you stop that in terms of like, because we've created a society where that's what generates money, right? Let's tell you this sappy story. But when people tell me that, like, oh, thank you for coming to the grocery store. You're such an inspiration. I always say, please don't call me that. And I said, my name's Letiah. But if I like climb Mount Everest or write a book, then you can say I did something inspirational. So I think it's just continuing to challenge people's ideas.
I think our best bet as people with disabilities is to get jobs at all of these organizations and stop them from using inspiration porn. And I've worked in a lot of nonprofits, and it's not impossible, especially bleeding heart nonprofits that probably want to hire someone who's inspiration porn for them. I think it's a toughie. I was thinking of this campaign Gillette Children's keeps running, and even like Lady Gaga signed a pledge for it. It was called Cure Pity. So they were trying, I think, in that sense to like cure pity, but also where does Gillette get its fundraising? Well, it's from showing cute kids in their wheelchairs and walkers and recovered from surgeries. They're posing with the Minnesota Twins baseball player. So it's not the adults that they're advertising who still have cerebral palsy and still need help. So, I do sometimes call into question, like, I think they are using inspiration porn as much as they're also trying to combat it. So you're getting a mixed message. But that's probably one of the better efforts I've seen. So.
And her follow-up question is, do you think religious communities could help with changing these attitudes?
yes. I think in terms of how in particular the healing narratives in scripture are told, which are usually like, oh, people saw this person with a disability and felt pity. So if we could stop doing theological malpractice is what I would say.
Yeah, good word. So I don't know if either of you has an answer to this question. This is a little bit of a specific policy question from Matt, our Canadian Reverend friend. So his question is that a good chunk of the film is about legislation, and he's wondering if in the US it's federal or state in terms of crafting and enforcing policy. Does either of you know the answer to that?
Yeah, I would say both. It depends on what the law is. And then it looks different about how states enforce those laws.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I was thinking, even with our Bill of Rights, our first 10 amendments, and including equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, it depends if that bill or that amendment is incorporated against the states or not on a federal level. So it basically takes court cases to get there, and for the courts to apply that against the states. Otherwise, certain states have certain protections or things that they that might even be better or different than on the federal level. And I think so. It's, from what I understood from the film, Califano was a federal representative.
He was the Secretary of the Health, Education, and Welfare. So yeah, he was connected. He was a cabinet member.
I think I didn't understand how he had an office in Berkeley, or that's what I was confused about. But yeah, so they were fighting for something on the federal level, and then it really wasn't being enforced, I think, is the problem.
Yeah.
And so 2 years later, in the 80s, with, I think it was Reagan trying to undo it with funding, and then finally 10 years after that, I think it was 93, right? So 13 years. Then the ADA is passed on the federal level, but it's still up to states and local municipalities to ensure that businesses enforce that. And sometimes there are protections in place, like if you're a really small business and you don't have money to add a ramp to your steps or whatever. So then that's why it ends up not being enforced, is what I mean, if that helps, Matt.
Yeah, great. And he can ask more offline.
He can DM me later.
So there's a question from Helen. Helen, do you want to, I'm going to unmute you so that you can ask your question about the hierarchy.
Hey, Helen.
Hey.
Hey.
Yeah, there was, excuse me, there was one part of the movie that really struck me, was when Denise was talking about there was a hierarchy in the disability community. The polio people were on the top and the CP people were on the bottom, and I'm visually impaired, and I know that in my experience, it's not just the disability experience, it's like any marginalized people group experience. Some people have had opportunities to advance themselves, and they tend to there's a non-shared experience. Like there's a mentality like, I did it and so can you, and why aren't you doing it? And I think Letiah kind of touched on that, but I was just wondering, have you, in your experience, experienced hierarchy based on type and severity of disability?
I would say yes. And also, I think, and maybe Bethany can say more about this, but I think that people within the disability community do it to each other. And so I think right now, I think sometimes what I've seen are that people that have intellectual disabilities are often put on the bottom. And then people with physical disabilities, may, depending on what they are put above that. And then maybe people with mental health disabilities are put above. Yeah. So yeah, I still think it does exist, but I think right now people with intellectual disabilities would be the people that are most marginalized, I think.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I'll say something about that because I do really think that it is, honestly, people with intellectual disabilities are mostly left out of the conversation because a lot of the disability rights movement has been about personal empowerment and independence. And for folks with intellectual disabilities who also have degrees of independence and things like that, but it isn't necessarily the, you know, it's not the same necessarily that there's degrees of independence that's possible, and there's some more support. And so when independence is like lifted up as the most important thing, there's a way that people who are significantly dependent in just daily activities are just not even in the conversation. So it's like, what does it look like to live a life of actual quite profound dependence, but also to have dignity and a level of independence within that? But really it's like for people that can't write or speak up for themselves, maybe don't use words to communicate at all, they get left out quite often in these conversations. So I would say that just like in any community, the people that are the best communicators, the most kind of able, all of that are at the top. And then it just filters down from there. That's been my experience. So there is a question about preaching in time of COVID that I'm gonna stop the recording and we'll answer that just because we're almost at time, but I wanna make sure your question gets answered, Ruth. So I just wanna first thank everyone for coming. We're gonna stay and answer one more question. If anyone else has questions, we can answer your questions too. Just really appreciate Letiah, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being in this conversation. I know there are a number of folks who are on the East Coast that didn't want to stay up so late and have asked for a recording. So we've been recording this conversation and we'll be sharing it with them. And I am just really grateful for all of you who have come. And if you haven't watched the movie yet, definitely watch it and watch it multiple times. As you'll see, it's worth it. And we're just grateful that you joined us here today. So thank you so much.